very image, loved by God, and created for a destiny. You have an inherent dignity. Those of you who are painfully shy, who wake up every morning feeling timid and afraid, Jesus has called you blessed. Those of you who find yourself at the edge of social circles, who look on not quite sure if you fit in or not, Jesus has welcomed you with open arms. Those of you who have experienced intense pain in your life, who have been used or abused by others, who feel cut off and alone in the world, who are fatherless, you need to know that you are loved by God. This is not a sentimental love of Hollywood movies or romance novels. You don't have to be beautiful or smart or physically fit. You don't even have to be a good person. In fact, God's love has no conditions at all. The message of the Bible, as Paul writes in Romans 5, is that God loved us while we were still sinners, while we were enemies of God. God loved us preemptively. Not because we earned it. We know this. Not because we earned it, but because God offers it as an unconditional gift. The Christian language for this is grace. God says, I know who you are. I see all of your self-loathing, your imperfections, your flaws, your weaknesses, your anger, all of the bad things you've done, and yet I still love you. The gospel is good news because it offers us the gift of God's unconditional love. The gospel is good news in the second place because it invites us to tell the truth. As you know, we live in a world that is filled with illusions. Some of those illusions are foisted on us from the outside. Commercials trying to convince you that you would be happier or healthier or better off if only you bought their product. Or all the media messages promising you happiness through money or leisure or alcohol or sex or whatever it is that turns you on. But many of the illusions also come from within. They're self-created. We can become very skilled at disguising our selfishness, at appearing to be virtuous, pretending to be self-righteous, or pretending to be righteous, while we're covering up all of the insecurities and weaknesses that we know are there. Throughout his ministry, Jesus consistently saw beneath the appearances to a deeper reality, and he spoke openly and honestly about what he saw. Think of the insight and the compassion, the honesty that he showed to the woman at the well, or the challenge that he posed to the Jewish mob that was about to stone the woman who was caught in adultery, or his critique of the Pharisees, who tithed mint leaves while ignoring basic questions of justice. For the rich young ruler who came to him as a wealthy man, a potential supporter of his cause, of the honesty that Jesus said, look, if you're going to be a follower, you've got to let go of your money. All of those parables that invite you to look beneath the appearances to a deeper reality. Honesty can be such a refreshing balm. I think all of us have been in settings where we were gingerly skirting around an issue, trying to avoid naming the thing that everybody has on their minds until somebody finally names it. It can become such a relief when people are actually honest. The message of Jesus is good news because it allows us to be honest, to name things for what they are, to help each other recognize our own blind spots, and then to move in a healthier direction. This isn't easy. In fact, it's possible only because we know that God's love is unconditional, that nothing exposed to the light is so bad that it will jeopardize God's love. And the freedom of being truly transparent, of being open, being honest to the world will make you come alive It is good news. Which brings me to a third point. The gospel is good news because it offers healing for our deepest wounds. In some ways, the Gospels are really only extended stories of Jesus as a healer. Wherever he went, in every encounter, Jesus sought to bring together that which was divided or broken or hurting. The most obvious examples, of course, are the many physical healings. The blind given their sight, the deaf restored to full hearing, the withered lived, the dead brought back to life. But Jesus also cared about healing broken minds and broken spirits, about restoring dignity to people who were living at the edges, at the margins of society, who were living in shame. The ministry of healing that we see in the gospel points towards the hope of wholeness, of health, of intimacy, of communion, what the scripture sometimes calls shalom. It's a wholeness that God intended for all of humanity, a wholeness that has been undone by sin and selfishness, but it waits to be restored. And so for me, the good news of the gospel is very simple. It invites us into the embrace of God's love. It pushes us to live in truth. And it offers healing for the wounds of our bodies and minds and spirit that are all too evident in our lives. So far, I think that virtually everything I've said would be more or less acceptable to a broad range of Christians and denominations. But what does that have to do with a Mennonite perspective? Well, the answer, I think, is everything. Why? Because the gospel, as I have described it, becomes alive. God's presence becomes real and tangible and relevant. It becomes good news only when God's love and truth and healing are actually made visible in our lives. At its best, the emphasis on discipleship and on community and on living lives that are committed to the gospel of peace, at its best, all of those distinctive qualities that Mennonites have sought to nurture are really nothing more than God's love and truth and healing made visible in the world. It's the good news of the gospel extended outward to others. Take the example of loving our enemies. I don't teach my children to love their enemies because it's a good survival strategy, or because it's heroic, or because I'm a liberal. No, I hope that they will love their enemies simply because that's exactly what God has done to you and me. That is to say, God loved you and me, even though we didn't deserve it. God loved you and me when we were enemies of God, and we bear witness. We give a testimony to the power and the depth of God's unconditional love when we individually and together commit ourselves to love other people in the world in the same way. Loving enemies or letting go of resentments or offering forgiveness instead of retaliation, these are not Mennonite doctrines. These are the natural, the inevitable responses of those who have received that same kind of good news from God. The same is true with a commitment to truth-telling. The freedom that the gospel offers to live in truth means that Christians will inevitably challenge the falsehoods and the lies of the society in which they live. Let me name some of those truths. Our country spends $1.4 billion every day on armaments. Every day, 35,000 people around the world die of starvation. A community that ignores racism or gender inequality in its midst is not a true community. There are people all around us, maybe some of you here, who are so lonely that the only way to numb the pain is through alcohol or drugs or computer games or maybe a long string of sexual conquests. Telling the truth doesn't always feel like good news. It often challenges our assumptions. It threatens the status quo. It often names our deepest fears. It makes our world more complicated. And sometimes Christians who are determined to speak the truth about the world forget that God actually loves this world in all of its brokenness. But that's the message of the third point. The gospel is an invitation to participate with God in the healing of our broken world. And you can't fully experience the power of God's healing in your own lives until you are ready to offer yourself in the healing of others. Whatever form it takes, whether it's public acts of service or private deeds of charity, Christian discipleship is an expression of the good news when it helps to heal some of the world's brokenness. But these are Christian truths, right? There's nothing uniquely Mennonite about this. Christian discipleship, in a Mennonite perspective, is nothing more than a public expression of the good news of the gospel. If one side of the coin is what God has done for us, the other side must be the reality of God's love, truth, and healing extended outward into the world. The two cannot finally be divided. What does this mean? It means that the good news of the gospel is relevant wherever you participate with God's movement in the world. It starts close to home, in our families, fidelity in marriage, with how we treat our spouses, how we relate to children. It extends to our communities, our witness to the power of Christ's active, gracious, reconciling love in our business transactions, in our local public schools, in the way that we connect with our neighborhood groups and participate in the life of our community. It includes our churches, our congregations, the way we treat each other in our congregations, in our conferences, the dignity and respect that we show for each other that becomes in itself a witness to the world. And it moves outward into the world in risky ways. Ways that you are already doing and some ways that you have not yet imagined. I must say that often I'm tempted to look on our tradition as, I've been involved in ecumenical conversations in the past years with the Catholics. There's 1.2 billion Catholics. You know that? And then with the Lutherans, there's 70 million Lutherans in the world. We're not a very big group. And it can feel sometimes like this understanding of the gospel seems pretty small sometimes. And yet, I'm struck over and over again how God finds ways of taking mustard seeds and making something powerful come of them. I'll close with a story. Several years ago, 15 years now, soon after 9/11, I agreed to write a little book on the gospel of peace called Choosing Against War. And I was hoping it would have a broad Christian readership. And it turned out that the book was translated into German. And because I'm a historian of German history and spent some time studying in Germany, I happened to be traveling in Germany. And I got a call from a little congregation in Berlin who had stumbled on the book and heard I was in Germany and asked if I would come and preach. And I said, sure, that would be interesting. It was a Baptist church in the middle of Berlin. was a church. Well, I didn't know this at the time, but the location of this little church in Bedding turns out to be important to the story. I began preaching in this little church, maybe 40 people there, and didn't get very far into my sermon on the gospel of peace when an old man sitting in the front began to cry. And I found that a little unsettling. I said already, I know my German isn't very good, but I didn't think it was that bad. But he continued to weep throughout the service. And as soon as I was done, he came right up to me, he grabbed my hand, he wouldn't let go, and he told me the story of this little Baptist church in Bedding. After World War II, when Hitler's armies had been defeated, and the Russian armies had moved west as far as Berlin, and the Allied armies had stopped on the other side of Germany, these former allies became enemies. As you know that story of the emerging tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States. And there followed then a Cold War. And in 1961, as one expression of the Cold War, the Soviet Union, in an effort to consolidate its power with the Warsaw Pact countries, built a wall right through the middle of Germany. And then the capital city, what had been the capital city in Berlin, they built a wall right through the middle of Berlin. And that wall went up quickly, so that friends and relatives had only days really to decide what side of the wall they were going to be on. And it happened that this little Baptist congregation in Bedding was located exactly in the trajectory of the wall. So that when the wall went up, the wall divided their congregation. And if, again, it's been a while since the wall was there, but some of you are old enough to have remembered or seen that wall. It was an imposing structure. It had mines on both sides. There was barbed wire. There were turrets. There were men with machine guns. People died trying to cross. It was an imposing, ugly, ugly wall. And the old man told me that when the wall went up, it was not only a symbol of the division of two superpowers, it was not only the division of a country, Germany, into two sides, but it was also a division of their church, a division of the body of Christ. And he said shortly after the wall went up, we knew we had to do something. And so he said on Sunday afternoons, beginning in the mid-1960s, he and some friends would every day at 3 o'clock, Sunday afternoon, would go outside their church and they would light a little candle and they would have a prayer. And they did that year after year after year. They did it through the 1970s, and they did it through the 1980s. And he said, we knew we had to do it. We had to bear witness to the fact that God's light, small though it is still powerful to transform hearts, to change the world. And he said towards the end of the 1980s, we sensed that something was shifting. And more people began to come for our services on Sunday afternoon. And then the soldiers would show up and they would taunt us. They would make fun of us. And they would threaten us. He said, they'd sit in the head with trembling hands, we held our candles high. And then in the fall of 1989, more and more people began to come. And in November of 1989, he said, the wall came down. The wall came down. And our divided congregation was reunited again. As you think about the challenges that face you and your congregation, challenges that face you personally, I want to invite you to go back to the basic foundational elements of the good news of the gospel. Know that in your darkest moment, in your darkest hour, that God's love for you and your congregation is